The United States has carried out its first drone strike in Yemen since Shia rebels took over and prompted the resignation of the country's president. A strike, which authorities say killed 3 al-Qaeda operatives, was viewed as a signal of the American government's continued counterterrorism strategy there. But on the same day, the U.S. closed its embassy in the capital of Sana'a to the public, sending a message of uncertainty. So what does Yemen's change in power mean for the United States, for the region, and for efforts to counter al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula? Joining me now to discuss are Barash Iban, investigator on the U.S. drone program in Yemen and Reprieve's Yemen project coordinator, Hisham Al-Omesi, a Yemeni information analyst, Jeremy Scahill, an investigative reporter at The Intercept, and joining us shortly will be Sama Al-Hamdani, a Yemen analyst and researcher. So I want to thank you all for joining me today. And, Hisham, perhaps that we could just start with you, and you can give us the latest situation. You are there in Sana'a, and tell us what the latest is that's going on. The Houthi leader just gave a speech on television. What was his message?
Actually, he's just started his speech about 30 minutes ago, which tends to go for about more than just an hour. So we are here with the Huffington Post and we didn't get a chance to see it. But in general, the situation is pretty much calm nowadays. After the president resigned, after the government resigned, there's still negotiations as to the next step, basically a presidential council or an interim government for a couple of months, or the Speaker of the Parliament becoming an acting president for a couple of months as well. Nothing is clear yet. Jamal bin Ahmed, of course, arrived before yesterday here in Sana'a, trying to lead the negotiations. But the negotiations haven't been successful so far, unfortunately. However, there's a good sign today, which is Ahmed bin Mubarak, the director of the presidential office. He was released today, which is a goodwill sign from the Houthis, and hopefully we'll see some more positive signs from the Houthis towards accepting the other parties.
So sorry about that. Yeah, you didn't get to check out the speech yet because you have been trying to get with us here on the Hangout. Jeremy, if we look at kind of the bigger picture here, how should people try to understand the political transitions that we're seeing in Yemen right now? When it comes to the Houthis taking over, but then at the same time, you have the former Yemeni president who has been supporting them. And how do we figure out where allegiances lie?
Well, first of all, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was the former dictator of Yemen and received a substantial amount of money and counterterrorism funds from the United States, is still very much a power player in Yemen. And, what's interesting is that it seems pretty clear that Ali Abdullah Saleh played a role. It's not clear how extensive of a role, but clearly played a role in facilitating the Houthis doing this somewhat unprecedented power grab. And what's ironic is that, from 2004 to 2010, Ali Abdullah Saleh waged 6 wars against the Houthis. And in fact, in the WikiLeaks cables, you see Ali Abdullah Saleh consistently trying to tell the United States that the Houthis are basically agents of Iran and that the United States should allow him to use his money to fight al-Qaeda to also fight the Houthis. And to their credit, Bush administration officials sort of said, we don't believe that. And right now, there's a lot of hype about Iran's role with the Houthis, but I think a lot of it is being exaggerated. It's not that Iran plays no role with the Houthis. It's that the tribal structure in Yemen is far more important than other nation states interfering. So what you have right now is that the Saudis are playing a very destructive role inside of Yemen. Iran wants to play a bigger role inside of Yemen. The U.S. drone campaign is not actually targeting the senior leadership of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, but rather hitting very low-level people and in some cases killing civilians. The U.S. did a drone strike yesterday on the Marib-Shebwa border, which is an area with a high concentration of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And my understanding is they killed 2 adults, 2 men, one of whom was from Saudi Arabia and had spent time in Saudi jails there on jihadist-related charges. Why he was freed is an interesting question. He then comes into Yemen. He joins al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and he was killed with another Yemeni. And the 2 of them, their primary work for AQAP was organizing against the Houthis. And they were issuing propaganda around Marib and Shebwa, encouraging non-AQAP tribes to take up the fight against the Houthis. And there was also a teenager killed in that strike whose father and brother had been killed in the previous strike. So the question right now is, why did the U.S. do this drone strike at this moment when Yemen is in political chaos, at a time when they're not hitting Waheshi, they're not hitting al-Asiri, they're bombing people whose primary work is mobilizing against the Houthis. And the New York Times quotes a senior Houthi today as basically saying the CIA did us a favor by killing these two men. So, why would the United States do this is a very interesting question. My sense is that the U.S. wants to simply say, we're going to drone no matter what happens in Yemen, and we don't really care about the internal situation as much as we do showing the world that we're tough.
Bara, what's your take on that? We're having a hard time hearing you. So actually, let me go to Sama instead, and Bara, we'll get you back as soon as we have your audio figured out there. Sama, are you with us?
Yes, I am with you.
Great. What's your take here on what Jeremy was saying about why it is that the United States had to, in this particular moment, during this type of political turmoil in Yemen, launch another drone strike?
I think the U.S. and many other countries that are Western are in a tough corner right now. They don't know who to talk to. Yemen doesn't have a government. And, of course, it's going to be really rough for them to kind of communicate with the militia. It's been known in Yemen that the U.S. Embassy in the past has communicated with top leaders in Yemen. So during the transitional period, they spoke with President Hadi and his government, but on the side, they also spoke to other power figures. So they met with Ali Mohsen, who's now reportedly in Saudi Arabia. No reports about where he is right now, but he was the top military advisor to the President Hadi and to President Saleh. They also communicated with Sheikh Al-Ahmar. So on the ground, they make efforts to communicate with top leaders. However, I'm not really sure what they can do in this time period. Obviously, their drone policy is very controversial, and they have targeted, wrong places, and they have killed many casualties. But having said that, I think that they are in a tough spot.
And Bara, I think, do we have you on the phone yet, Bara? Or are we still working on it? Okay, I think we're still working on getting Bara there. Jeremy, what about this also playing into, or perhaps you could explain for our viewers, I think a lot of people think of the United States counterterrorism strategy in Yemen, and they only think of drone strikes, but it goes much farther than just that.
Right. I mean, look, every time Yemen pops into the news, it's because of some sort of spectacular event, either the Paris attacks or the change in government. But in reality, for many, many years, the U.S. has played a very destructive role in Yemen, not just about drone strikes against AQAP. The United States was giving a lot of support to Ali Abdullah Saleh and his family members. A lot of money and training that was supposed to be used to fight Al-Qaeda was used to gun down peaceful protesters or to be used for internal domestic struggles within Yemen. And similar to what the U.S. has done in Egypt and with Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the Arab and Muslim world, the U.S. takes the side of a dictator over ordinary people. And so you can't just say that what U.S. policy in Yemen is just about drones or just about al-Qaeda. The U.S. has played an active role in destabilizing Yemen and also in allowing Ali Abdullah Saleh and his people to beat them in their own chess game. Ali Abdullah Saleh was always smarter than the Americans at dealing with Yemen, and that's just the fact of the matter. So the U.S. played an active role in creating these circumstances.
And Hisham, does Ali Abdullah Saleh now come back into power? Is he kind of a middleman or seen as somebody who might be the best middle of the road type of leader to take, or at least to take advantage of the power vacuum that we're seeing at the moment?
Well, here's the thing. Abdullah Saleh coming back to power, that's totally out of the question. He's not going to be accepted by the public, nor is he planning to. He's more of an instigator. He plans to control puppets on the scene. But as far as coming back as a political leader, that's totally out of the question. And then people tend to exaggerate that. That's not going to happen. That's one thing. The other thing, in regards to the drone strike that happened in Marib, people forget that the Houthi rhetoric over the past few weeks was that Marib is full of AQAP. There's a big controversy locally that Marib is manned by Islah or tribal leaders, not AQAP. The drone strike basically validated the Houthi claims that AQAP is indeed in Marib, which is basically going to excite a lot of Houthis and give them reason to move into there. That's one thing. The other thing people forget is how many people, how many AQAP did we prosecute in Yemen? How many did we give the death sentence to? None. So when people complain that the drones did have a backlash, did actually hurt people, it did. I'm not pro-drones, but look at the other side as well. Just a couple of years ago, 100 soldiers were killed in Tahrir Square, and the AQP behind it were sentenced from 2 to 10 years only. That's a very, very light sentence. Families of those soldiers, when they hear that there's a drone strike that actually took out the culprits, they actually celebrated. Major news agencies don't cover that. They only cover the outcry from the drone strike, how it violated the sovereignty of the state, how it hurt a lot of people, how it killed kids. Well, let's look at the other side as well. How many kids, how many people did AQP hurt? Is the government capable of getting those guys, putting them in prison, sentencing them? No. How many AQPs did escape from prison? Many. How many did we prosecute and sentence to death? None. Just wanted to say that.
That's certainly a perspective that we don't often hear a lot of, Barat. How do you respond to that? Because we do only hear about drone strikes in the press, where we're always just told that it's Al-Qaeda militants of some sort that are taken out, and then we hear a lot of outrage and the negative way in which it can affect, of course, civilians and breed more resentment. But is there not enough, or at least any semblance, really, of accountability within Yemen itself?
Well, I think this gets us back to the question of the day when the agreement, what was called the GCC agreement brokered by the GCC countries, which was supposed to build the capacity of the Yemeni security and military, but that didn't happen, and simply that's because the United States took into their hands the file of the security and military rebuilding, and what they focused actually was continuing the funding of the counterterrorism operations, and wanted a government that are going to continue counter-terrorism operations on the ground. The United States didn't seem to care actually that the government is not actually doing proper steps towards a proper law enforcement or the rule of law that is absent in those areas. Instead, the drone program continues. We witnessed more drone strikes than we witnessed in the days of Ali Abdullah Saleh, and it didn't seem that the United States cared actually if the Yemeni people had a democratically elected government. As soon as the counterterrorism cooperation will continue, the current president can continue. The outcomes of the national dialogue that stated clearly about how to build the military structure, both the military and security structure, were totally neglected by what people in the policy political making level like to call our friends, our partners, the United States and the European Union. I think all of those together led to the fall and the collapse of the military structure in the country, leading to only one fact that we might have no country, we might have no government, we might have even not a president, but the drone program will continue.
And one of the other things, too, that we now see being discussed in news reports is whether or not the separatist movement in the south, which is certainly concerned with what they see happening with Houthis taking over in the other parts of Yemen, whether or not that is creating a vacuum that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is also able to exploit, whether this is leading to more recruitments there. Sama, what's your take on that?
Well, my take is slightly different. I think that Yemen's judicial system has been failing long before 2011, right before the revolution. I think to blame all the mistakes that we're witnessing today on a failed revolution is a bit extreme. Yemen has been in bad shape ever since the early 90s, and we've seen a deterioration in the judicial system since. Corruption in Yemen is a very common thing, and it's very institutionalized, and we all know that to get from point A to point B, we have to kind of somehow get involved in something like that to process our papers. Or, as Yemenis, we know that we can't go to the law unless we're connected to someone, or some tribal sheikh can back us up, or someone in the government can help us out. And that's been the case in Yemen for years. I think the problem here is that the South has been calling for secession ever since 2009. In reality, they've been calling for it since 1994, but their voices were quieted down. So what the revolution did is it gave them the opportunity to raise their voice higher. The problem with the Southern secession is that it's a coalition group made up of smaller groups that fail to unite in their agenda. They have claimed that they've talked, they've held meetings, they've held summits, and even the National Dialogue Conference, which I think it's very safe to say now has failed, was organized by the UN. They've managed to organize events for the Southerners, and they tried to bring them together. But everything that has tried to unite the Southerners in their cause has failed. And I think the problem here in Yemen is that a lot of the leading figures that we see, whether they're in the north or in the south, are older figures that had a huge part to play in Yemen's history. And so when they come back on the scene, they have their whole entire history with them. And so when these leaders are trying to kind of unite for something new, they fail to do so because the people in the south cannot forget their past, and their past was very bloody. And so in that sense, what we see in Yemen now is a divide militarily, where Sana'a the capital is under the occupation of the Houthi group. However, the south is controlled very strongly by the military. And that's kind of odd because it makes somebody think that, what happened to the military? We've talked about the restructuring that took place in 2011. The restructuring failed, in my opinion, because it was done in a not so well manner, in the sense that they tried to weaken Ali Abdullah Saleh's powers, and in a sense they alienated many of his soldiers that should have not been alienated. They should have been brought back because that's their profession, to work in the military. And so with the military disintegration, why is there a strong military presence in the south and not in the north? What is going on here? There are so many questions that need to be answered. And I think the most important question that we all need to be asking is not what America's role is in Yemen. Because if America tries to interfere any more in anything else, then the Yemenis would pretty much accuse of the U.S. of going way past what they're supposed to do. They're already doing that technically in the drone program. However, President Hadi welcomed their drone program, so the government welcomed every American effort on the ground. And so in a sense, I don't think we should be asking what should America do. We should ask what should the Yemenis do? What should they do to save themselves from the situation that's really tricky and that it's going to lead to Yemen's demise? So I think we need to focus on how Yemen can recover, because right now it's playing into the proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
And that's the thing, right? Maybe the question is not what can other countries do, but what will they do? Because we also know that no matter what, the United States is going to continue its counterterrorism operations here, especially because of in recent weeks the attacks in Paris that happened, and AQAP taking responsibility for that. So now they can also use that, as a sign of AQAP continuing to be a major threat. But Jeremy, do you think that we should be looking more at regional disturbances here? And as Samad just pointed out there, what this means in terms of the power playing between Iran and Saudi Arabia than what the U.S. might do?
Well, I mean, also part of the history of the south of Yemen is that when the British colonial era, ended, and there was, something semi-resembling, socialism in the south of Yemen, a lot of the very wealthy tribal leaders who were collaborating with the British lost their wealth and went into exile in the Emirates or elsewhere. And part of what Ali Abdullah Saleh did when he consolidated power, with a unified Yemen, was to allow back into the south and to give land back to a lot of these very wealthy tribal sheikhs who were generally living in exile. And Hisham's point about Al-Qaeda not being put on trial or being given the death penalty is interesting in that context because clearly there are very powerful people within the tribal structure and Yemeni institutions that are benefiting from the perception that Al-Qaeda is in Yemen is this global menace, when in reality AQAP has only effectively carried out mass killings inside of Yemen. Yes, the failed underwear bomb plot originated in Yemen. Yes, there seems to be a connection to the Paris attacks. Yes, they did try to put an explosive onto a UPS plane that was heading for the United States. But outside of those incidents, if you look at the history of AQAP, their primary targets have been Yemenis or Saudis. And so who benefits from having this perception that AQAP represents this big threat to the United States? There are powerful people in Yemen that benefit from that, but also Al-Qaeda itself benefits from it. I was in touch with an Al-Qaeda operative recently who said that the current situation for them is perfect. They don't want to be in power. They don't want to govern. They want chaos. And it goes back to one of the key documents of jihadist thinking in the modern era, an essay called The Management of Savagery. And the author of that is anonymous, but it's widely cited by many, many jihadist groups from Al-Qaeda Central to Al-Shabaab to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And one of the key principles of that document is that you don't want to take power. You want to make it impossible for anyone else to govern so that you can exploit the vacuum. And so the situation in the South and the situation in Sana'a right now are benefiting Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and their powerful tribal and institutional backers.
Hisham, do you have anything to say to that? Is it really chaotic, or do you think that this could also be seen as an opportunity, perhaps? All the points that Jeremy is making there, to try to take advantage and create some kind of a situation where rationale might prevail?
I actually totally and fully agree with Jeremy, with what he said. Basically, the way that Al-Qaeda does it is that destabilize the situation, rely on tribal relations to sort of instigate more of an anarchy where they could actually prosper. And Jeremy actually is right when he said more and more of Al-Qaeda, they're relying on the tribal connections so that they're not going to be prosecuted by the state. And vice versa, there are a lot of people in the state and traditional leaders who benefit from an AQAP becoming this monster organization that is in Yemen that has much of a footprint here locally, but not much of an impact internationally. And I just want to add one thing to what Sama said. When Sama said about why the military didn't disintegrate in the South, that actually goes back again to the same argument that Jeremy said, of the tribal confederates and the traditional leaders being the real power jockeys in the state. It actually is the same in the South with the military camps. Those military units weren't disintegrated because they were protecting the resources in the South, protecting companies like Total, protecting some areas of the LNG. And Ali Abdullah Saleh had an interest of not breaking those units. Hadi took over. He had the same vested interest in not disintegrating those units. He made his whole focus of disintegrating the units that are actually loyal to Saleh and the previous regime. So the restructuring of the army wasn't exactly a restructuring of the army as much as destroying those who are loyal to Saleh.
So, Bara, in this case too, I'm kind of going back to something that we touched on a little bit earlier, but because you do focus so much too on the drone program within Yemen, is there a little too much focus on it? Is there an oversimplification that comes with looking at the drone strikes in Yemen as opposed to these tribal differences that we're seeing and the power plays at hand?
Well, I think it's the whole focus on Yemen as a ground as an operation ground for counterterrorism efforts in general. And the problem is that the recent situation that we're living in inside Yemen is simply because Hadi had tons of opportunities, and he had the tools, but kept losing each and every opportunity as it came to him. And the focus was, as long as the counterterrorism efforts are going to continue, I can make sure that the United States are going to be happy with me staying in power. But with time, actually, what we witnessed is that he was losing his tools and the opportunities to stabilize the country. Almost none of the focus was going on into any of the outcomes of the national dialogue or the GCC agreement that could have ensured, if rightfully implemented, that many of the people in power could have left by now. The transitional justice law, as an example, was put aside by the president and his advisors, because many of those people actually, even though benefited from Saleh being out of power, but actually were violators at a certain point. The issue with the South, I just mentioned, there was no actually real solution, as there was a lot of talks and discussions going on throughout the country, but actually no real implementation of any of the outcomes was implemented. The people on the ground didn't feel there was a change. The feeling of the change that came in the revolution in 2011, people didn't feel that there was a real will of implementation. Again, going back to the focus of the drone program, you can imagine how many phone calls I received since yesterday about this single drone strike and the United States closing its embassy and its services in the country, while at the same time we're living at a moment where the president and the government both handed their resignation, and I didn't see that much of interest from the international media outlets to a country maybe reaching to the brink of a collapse, and I think this is because of the way the United States shaped its view into the country. I agree with Sama very much that it's not the United States we should be blaming. It's more our leaders. But I think it's more of a balance between those two, because we thought after 2011 that the United States learned the lesson that it should start working with the people, not with the leaders. But it again came back trying to empower certain people in power, neglecting the demands of the majority of the people, dealing with the situation as it's the interest of a certain political elite, not the dreams of 25 million people in the country. And I think without focusing on the interests of the people in the future, in any coming government or any coming agreements that may come in the coming few days, it should focus on building the capacity of a government, of a proper law enforcement. It might take time. It might take it's not a quick solution, but it's more strategic, more effective, and more safe.
All right, I have to leave it there. But Bara, Hisham, Jeremy, and Sam, I want to thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, guys, thanks for watching, and stick around. There's much more coming up on HuffPost Live.